All right, ladies and gents, welcome back. So today we're going to talk about some patterns that we see when we start studying evolution and evolutionary change in species. And the first two that often come up are these ideas of convergent evolution versus divergent evolution. And really, when we look at these terms, only one of them truly is evolution by definition. So where do the terms come from then? So when we look at the idea of convergent evolution, if you've ever heard of converging lines, we're talking about lines that converge to a point, they come together. And convergent evolution is sort of a misnomer because it's not true evolution. What we're looking at is different species that don't share common ancestry, so they're not really related to each other, but they've converged or come together on similar characteristics because of the niches that they live in. What's their job in their ecosystem? What's the environment that they live in? So when I look at something like a shark and a dolphin, they've converged onto having very similar physical characteristics, the dorsal fins, the streamed body line. Why? Because they both live in the oceans and they're sort of high on the food chain. But if you really look at their ancestry and where they are related, they're kind of not. You'd really have to go deep into their family trees to find any connections. Your sharks are fish. Your dolphins, on the other hand, are mammals, and so the only real connection is that they've come together on similar traits. Not true evolution. On the other hand, go over to your red fox and your kit fox. This is divergent evolution, so the lines, rather than coming together, are diverging or coming apart from each other. Divergent evolution is true evolution. They shared a common ancestor, those ancestors moved into different environments, and over many, many generations, that kit fox and that red fox have sort of diverged on from each other, have now different characteristics because of the environments they live in. If I tried to take those two, mate them together, they'd no longer produce fertile offspring simply because their genetic structure is no longer similar enough. But if I could go deeper into their family tree, we'd eventually find more and more similar genetic characteristics because they do, in fact, share a common ancestor. So don't get this confused. Convergent evolution is not true evolution. They've only converged on similar characteristics because of where they're living, because of what they do. Divergent evolution is truly what we're talking about when we discuss evolutionary change. They've got a common ancestor, but they are now diverse and different species as a result of the changes in their environment over time. We also see a lot of coevolution, and this is particularly true in things like predator-prey relationships, where I've got a predator who is evolving to get better at catching its prey, but as that prey gets eaten, it then evolves to try and be better at evading its predator. So if I look at something like the example here at the bottom with the crab and the snail, if I look at that general crab population, all right, the thickness of their pincers, there's going to be variation. Some are going to be thinner and smaller, some are going to be thicker and stronger. So as that crab, I'm going to go after the easiest prey I can. It takes energy to get my prey. So natural selection is going to assume that, well, I look at that snail population and there's equal variation in the thickness and spininess of their shells. Well, those predators are going to go after the easy prey, take these guys out first. As these guys continue to get eaten up, that means those who are thicker and more spiny are the ones who are reproducing and passing the traits on. So, what happens? Well, these guys quickly deplete in the population, and so now this becomes more common. Well, remember, there's variation in those crabs as well. Those guys who really are kind of on the weak end of the spectrum, who really this was about all they could get, they're now losing their food source. They're going to be the ones who don't survive and reproduce as often. And so I end up seeing an evolution in my predator having those thicker, more powerful claws. As that guy eats now the weaker of the spined shells on these snails, okay, we see an evolutionary progression in them. Once again, these guys who weren't able to eat these more spiny, thicker shelled snails die off, don't reproduce, and so I get a stronger, more better predator on that end. And so it kind of continues to work its way from there. We can also have a situation where we talk about adaptive radiation. And rather than just talking about a single species diverging into two, we get a situation like the Galapagos finches, where that adaptive radiation takes that original ancestral species, moves it into multiple environments, and those multiple environments provide natural selection the ability to work. So I go from that mainland finch species, right, that's moving in here to this main island. Those islands then bop around. Different species move to different islands, and when I get to those different islands, different food sources are available, and so the natural selection happens from there. All right, and so we end up seeing that diversity happening from a single species now sort of radiating out or giving me, I think there's 9 different finch species that now exist on those Galapagos that originally all came from the same ancestor, and the evolutionary process, the divergence point for all of those 9 species is approximately the same period of time coming from that original mainland ancestor. So it radiates out like a spoke on a wheel. There's also a timing idea here. So there's a lot of question as to how quickly evolution happens. And even if we could all scale it down to the same scale for every species, there's still some interesting patterns that show up. So Darwin was really on the side of this gradualism model, that speciation is sort of slow and steady. These small changes are happening over various, very long periods of time. And so we're getting one species that turns into another species that turns into another species as time progresses, and changes in those environments occur. So it's slow, it's constant, it's consistent. Something like this. So I look at that single ancestral moth. All right, he's down here, and I get some divergence that happens because of moving into different environments, and that evolutionary change continues to happen on both sides of that scale until I get to my common or current species that I have now. So it's gradual, it's slow, it's often local. And this probably is existing for certain traits or for certain species. But go to the 1980s and a new model popped up, and that's this idea of punctuated equilibrium, where essentially what we're saying is that we get these quick bursts of change in the environment, and as a result, also quick, rapid changes in species. But then as the environment stabilizes out, we really don't see a whole lot of change in the species. It kind of stays steady, does its thing, and then another quick change in the environment occurs, causing speciation to happen again, and then the environment stabilizes out, and so does the evolutionary change. All right. So it would look something more like this instead, where I get these quick bursts, and then there really aren't any transitional changes in between. And the reality is, it's probably a little of both. It depends on the gene you're talking about, the trait you're discussing, the species you're talking about or researching. And so there probably isn't really one quick answer. You got to dig into more specific examples, but understand that both are potentially there to exist. Just this slow, gradual change or these quick, rapid changes, and then everything kind of levels out for a while. Something to remember, regardless of how you talk about evolution, whether it's gradual, whether it's punctuated, whether you're talking divergent evolution in general, evolution, regardless, is overall a continuous process. So long as the environments are changing, the populations have to adapt and change with it, and if they can't, they go extinct. Other thing to keep in the back of your head when we're talking about how evolution occurs is that individuals don't evolve. They also can't go extinct. They're either born with the characteristics that are going to allow them to be adaptive and survive in their environment and reproduce better than someone else, or they're just not. You can't change your genetic structure as an individual, but the populations overall, that's what can evolve. That can be what changes. The allele frequencies can adjust, and that's how evolution's happening. And remember that this only works on inherited traits. Don't fall into Lamarckian evolution. All right. I have to have these genes coded for my DNA. It can't be something I learn. It can't be something that I train myself to do in my lifetime, because that's not what gets passed on. When we're talking about passing information from one generation to the next, the only thing that moves is the DNA. So in order for evolution to work, natural selection to select for something, it comes down to that reproduction, and it comes down to inherited traits. The other thing to keep in mind is that evolution can't anticipate anything. So we're utilizing these terms like choose and nature's choosing for something, but there is no choice. There's also no foresight. All right, if we look back through evolutionary history at things like transitional fossils and we look at all of these characteristics, we very well may be able to go, yeah, that fossil has that characteristic. Would have been really beneficial to them 500 million years later, but it got weeded out because at that point in time, it was actually not beneficial to the point where it was so harmful that the species got rid of it. All right, and I can't just bring it back. I can't just resurrect it once it's gone. So there's no anticipation of future change. The reverse is also true. All right, evolution isn't trending towards some sort of goal. There's nobody manipulating this. It's random chance as to what environments these guys find themselves in, what characteristics they might have. Maybe some random mutation happens that gets them a trait that's better, but I can't predict that piece. All I can work on is what is currently in place in terms of the traits that that species has and work it within the environment that they're currently in. So keep that in mind. There is no goal towards this. It isn't necessarily striving to become more complex, although it may seem that way on the surface.